Dave Rubin recently did an hour-long interview on the David Pakman show, and it was just littered with nonsense. In this video, I'm going to break down and refute some of the more egregious falsehoods or sloppy arguments made by Dave Rubin in that interview. We're going to start off with a very simple one that's almost too easy to disprove.
You could actually make lots of arguments that the right has changed. There's virtually no one on the right that cares about gay marriage anymore. That's a pretty significant thing.
You should see the people that write to me, Dave. You should see the people that write to me.
There's virtually no one on the right that cares about gay marriage anymore.
That is just flat out false. While there's no question that support for gay marriage has been increasing over the years, Gallup reports that in 2017, only 47% of Republicans support gay marriage, while Pew reports that only 40% support it. That is to say, not even a majority of Republicans support gay marriage. Furthermore, Republican lawmakers haven't given up on this subject either. For example, as The Hill reports, in April of 2017, quote, Republican state lawmakers in North Carolina are proposing a bill that would ban gay marriage in the state. North Carolina State Representatives Larry Pittman, Michael Speciale, and Carl Ford, all Republicans, are the primary sponsors of the Uphold Historical Marriage Act. The bill says that the U.S. Supreme Court overstepped its constitutional bounds in the 2015 decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. End quote. As another example, in February of 2017, quote, 2 Republican lawmakers were booed out of a Tennessee press conference this week after they filed a bill against same-sex marriage. The bill argues that Tennessee doesn't have to follow the Supreme Court's ruling on same-sex marriage. End quote. So to say that there's virtually no one on the right that cares about gay marriage anymore is plainly untrue.
On the issue of the single-payer healthcare, though, because I think this is a good lens, specifically because of your views on this, do you agree that single-payer would not be the libertarian perspective with a slight tweak to make it the classically liberal perspective? It is diametrically opposed to what a classical liberal would want.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I get invited to a lot of college things, and I'm always invited, by the way, by conservatives or libertarians usually, or people of the right, which is funny to me because you'd think it shows that they're certainly willing to talk to people who are pro-choice and pro-weed or pro-gay marriage or whatever, and I get no invites from anyone on the left.
What does this have to do with the question that you were just asked about where single-payer healthcare falls along the political spectrum? The more I hear from Dave Rubin, the more I notice that he will seemingly use every available opportunity to bash the left, even when it's completely uncalled for. You could walk up to Dave Rubin on the street, be like, beautiful day we're having, and there's a 99% chance he would respond by saying, yeah, well, you know who's probably going to ruin this beautiful day? The left. Dave, there's a very simple explanation for why you receive so many invitations from right-wing organizations. A huge chunk of your show is dedicated to just bashing people on the left. You and your guests have spent an enormous amount of time on the Rubin Report, agonizing about the regressive left, about SJWs, safe spaces, trigger warnings, shrieking college students, and so forth. Add to that the fact that you're constantly giving a platform on your show to people on the right wing, and oftentimes allowing them to basically espouse their views while just nodding your head and not challenging them in any serious way, and it's no wonder that you receive such a warm reception from people on the right. I imagine Noam Chomsky doesn't receive a great deal of invitations to be the keynote speaker at conferences held by neoconservative foreign policy hawks. Richard D. Wolff most likely does not get showered with invitations from any free market capitalist organizations. Dave seems to ascribe this invitation disparity to some kind of innate tolerance and open-mindedness of people on the genteel right. But there's clearly a much simpler explanation. They view him in a lot of ways as their ally.
But look, we know that they've done a zillion studies on it. I don't want to quote the number wrong, but that's something like 80 or 90% of professors in America are liberal to left. Now, it depends what you mean by liberal, of course, in that case. But we know that the conservative viewpoint is not being taught in colleges. And by the way, it's leaking into not just the humanities. It's actually leaking into the science stuff. And I was at a conference with about 400 college professors in Dallas a couple weeks ago, and many people were talking about that.
There's a lot to say here. First off, why would you expect either a conservative or liberal viewpoint to be taught in the majority of university courses? If you're studying something like geology, engineering, computer science, mathematics, accounting, or nursing, political ideologies aren't going to come up very often because they're just not relevant to the field that these people are studying. So for much of college teaching, the professor's political views don't ultimately matter, because it's not like they're going to be coming up in class every single day. And even if there was this epidemic of political views seeping into university lectures, how much of an effect would this truly have on students? Many college students are perfectly capable of thinking for themselves. If when I was in college a professor came in one day and started talking about how great it would be to eliminate environmental regulations, I can assure you that I wouldn't just mindlessly bow down before his podium and say, well, he's a professor, so he must be right, and I must therefore adopt his views. No, I'd say, this guy's full of shit, and here's why. Dave says that the liberal viewpoint is leaking into the sciences, and conversely implies that the conservative viewpoint is simultaneously receding. I've got news for you, Dave. Maybe the conservative viewpoint isn't being taught in the sciences because it's simply unscientific and not supported by evidence. You know what they teach in college, especially in the sciences? The things that are most supported by evidence. The things that the experts in that particular field have largely come to a consensus about. This brings to mind that cliché statement that reality has a liberal bias. He doesn't give any particular examples of exactly which conservative viewpoints he thinks should be taught, but some that come to mind which are demonstrably false and plainly unscientific are climate change denialism and young Earth creationism. Things like this aren't taught in colleges, and people who hold these beliefs aren't professors at respectable universities, not because there's some kind of nefarious, liberal conspiracy at work, but because these views are plainly untrue. And when I say colleges, I mean actual, respectable universities, not crackpot religious colleges, like Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. It's a bit of a misclassification to even call some of these viewpoints conservative, because while they are associated with and commonly held by conservatives, they aren't political questions. What the age of the Earth is, what the explanation is for the diversity of life on our planet, whether greenhouse gas emissions cause global warming, these are scientific questions. There is simply a factual answer to the question of what the age of the Earth is. It's not like there's a liberal opinion and a conservative opinion on this subject, and there's no way to ascertain who's correct, so we just have to agree to disagree. No, one group is simply correct and the other is wrong. So it is with global warming and other basic scientific questions that there's a clear answer to and consensus about. And of the less scientific conservative viewpoints, such as views on economics, taxation, regulation, and government philosophy, these are taught in colleges. Just pick up an economics or history or political science textbook, and you'll learn all about these conservative viewpoints, in addition to other views on these questions. It's not like the required textbook for these classes is a Bernie Sanders campaign book or something. And he also complains about how the vast majority of professors lean liberal. Well, what explains this disparity? Part of the explanation is that people who hold views antithetical to the scientific consensus aren't going to advance to professorship in those fields. The young Earth creationist, who's very likely to also be conservative politically, is not going to be allowed by any respectable university to teach biology or astronomy or geology. The climate change denier, again, very likely to be conservative politically, is not going to teach atmospheric science, and so forth. I'm reminded of intelligent design advocate William Dembski complaining in his debate against Christopher Hitchens about being ostracized from academia after he became a vocal, public proponent of his absurd creationist views.
Okay, So this method then identifies what I call specified complexity. In the design inference, I showed how this method applies outside biology. By the way, when I did this outside biology, I was in good shape. People were writing all sorts of nice things about my work. Once I applied it in biology, though, my career went down the toilet and I can no longer get a job in the mainstream academic world.
Good riddance as far as I'm concerned. Don't let the door hit your dumb ass on the way out. Another part of the explanation for this disparity could be that people who are well educated, and thus ultimately become professors, tend to be more left-leaning. The statistics on political affiliation and educational attainment levels seem to support this hypothesis. Pew Research reports that Democratic affiliation increases in direct proportion to one's educational level. We see that of those with some college education, 47% identify as or lean Democrat, compared to 42% Republicans, a 5% difference. Of those who have graduated college, the disparity is even greater. 52% either identify as or lean Democrat, compared to 40% Republican, a 12% difference. And of those with postgraduate experience, we see the greatest disparity. 56% identify as or lean Democrat, compared to only 36% who identify as or lean Republican, a 20% difference. Now, we can't say, from this correlational data, that the attainment of higher education is necessarily the cause of the left-leaning political affiliation. It could be the case that Democratic affiliation actually motivates the seeking of higher education, for whatever reason, or maybe some third variable is responsible for both Democratic affiliation and higher education levels, such as the regular reading or viewing of certain left-leaning outlets. Whatever the true explanation for the pattern, we can say from this data that, on average, the higher a person's educational level, the more likely they are to be on the left. So it's not a huge mystery that the majority of professors in America are politically left. Dave also put forth a few noteworthy strawmen in this interview. First, we have one about Trump and Russia.
If we were to go on the assumption for a second, I'll do it both ways for you. If we're going on the assumption that Trump did somehow collude with Russia, then what you're saying is that technically we should be at war with Russia right now, that you'd have to then depose Trump and, of course, Pence, and then I guess you then install the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan.
If Trump did somehow collude with Russia, then we should be at war with Russia? What an incredible leap that is. Trump colluded with Russia, and we should be at war with Russia are two completely separate statements that each require completely separate justifications. And this wasn't a misstatement or exaggeration. He doubles down on this later in the interview.
My point is that if you're saying that there was collusion or they knew about all this, we are in effect at war. I mean, could there possibly be a bigger act of war than installing a president? So what you're saying is that if it would then be President Ryan, or we'd have to redo an election and get Hillary, I mean, the first thing we would have to do is go to war with Russia. I do not want to go to war with Russia. I don't think there's any reason to go to war with Russia.
I can't believe I have to explain that collusion between Trump and Russia would not necessitate an instant escalation to military engagement with Russia. There are plenty of other steps that could and would be taken before we start dropping bombs and killing people. And he asks rhetorically, and I hope hyperbolically, could there possibly be a bigger act of war than installing a president? Yeah, there could be. How about a physical invasion involving troops, gunfire, tanks, fighter jets, missile launches, blockades, and the killing of civilians and enemy soldiers? Another Dave Rubin flavored strawman came out of absolutely nowhere during a discussion on taxes, which also features a pretty good gotcha point by David Pakman.
But again, as a general rule, I want you, David Pakman, as a small business owner, which you are with employees, to pay the least amount of taxes that you can so that you can hire more people, so that you can build a better studio, so that you can invest more in your operation and bring the goodness that is you and your operation out there. I know this as a small businessman now. If I had been being taxed higher right now, I had massive capital costs to build this studio, and do all this stuff. By the way, I pay 100% of my employees' health insurance, 100%. I also give, my director gets a cut of our YouTube rev. I do all the things. I try to put my beliefs into practice.
But that's the confusion for me, Dave, because those capital expenses are tax deductible. So if the tax rate goes up for you as an individual, if you've got pass-through income, or for the business tax rate, it doesn't matter what the business tax rate if you want to spend money on capital, because you don't pay taxes on that. Actually, it encourages you to spend money on capital to have a higher tax rate.
So I understand what that argument is, and I would argue at the same time as that, that having every one of us, however much you earn, it is your money. It is your money. We get taxed in all kinds of other ways with sales tax and everything else. I pay payroll tax and blah, blah, blah. And I would say the best way to, if you're on the left or you're a progressive and you hate Trump and you hate what this government has become, I don't think that the best answer is to topple the government and destroy this incredible experiment, which is what it is, this American experiment. I don't think the best way is to destroy it. I think the best way is to rein in the power that it has over us. And one of the ways you can do that is by giving it less money. I think that the government could function a lot slimmer and trimmer. I think actually you could probably get most progressives to admit that the government is a giant waste. But often they'll tell you how much they hate the government, and then the solution is more government or more taxes. I would say the only way to really control this stuff is to tighten the strings on the finances, and you have the right to keep as much as possible of what you earn. Right now, if you're on the left or you're a progressive and you hate Trump and you hate what this government has become, I don't think that the best answer is to topple the government and destroy this incredible experiment, which is what it is, this American experiment.
Where the fuck did that come from? He is just way out in left field here. They're talking about taxes, and out of nowhere, he's basically just like, look, if you hate Trump, I don't think you should try to destroy America. What progressives, or people on the left, are arguing that we should destroy this American experiment, or try to topple the government? What an extreme position to bring up. This is obviously not representative of the general viewpoints held by people on the left who oppose the Trump administration. Seriously, who is saying, yeah, Trump, he's a complete disaster, so we should try to destroy America? Who is even making the less extreme statement that we should topple the government in some kind of a coup? These viewpoints are purely the product of Dave's imagination. Next, we have a pathetic, failed attempt by Dave Rubin to point out an overarching contradiction among the left generally.
If your issues are think about all I was on TYT for years. Everything's about the government's horrible, everyone's corrupt, everyone's evil, corporations, money is destroying everything, billionaires, blah, blah, blah. What's your answer? Make the government bigger, tax people more, force the government to do more, blah, blah, blah. That seems antithetical to logic and reason.
Oh, the irony of somebody unreasonably claiming that something is unreasonable. There is no contradiction or hypocrisy here. One can simultaneously oppose government corruption while at the same time supporting things like single-payer healthcare, higher taxes on the wealthy, and so forth. Wanting to make the government bigger by, for example, instituting a single-payer healthcare system doesn't mean that we also want to increase the scope of governmental corruption. Have the government do more things is not equal to please increase government corruption. I should also point out that wanting the government to take on new functions doesn't necessarily translate into making the government bigger, and that's because along with the implementation of something like single-payer healthcare could come dramatic cuts in areas like military spending. So the overall amount of money spent and the overall amount of government employees needed could actually stay about the same, or maybe even decrease, depending upon whether commensurate cutbacks are made in other areas.
So I thought it would be interesting, Dave, to talk a little bit about, because you're increasingly not doing this on your show deliberately, as you talked about, in order to stay away from the sort of 24-hour news cycle. Generally speaking, we're 6 months into the Trump administration. How do you assess this presidency so far?
Anyway, I did not vote for him, my feeling was after the election, my feeling was that the fact that the chessboard, as I described before, has been thrown up and everyone's reevaluating things, versus that if Hillary had been elected, the screws that had about all the stuff that we talk about mainstream media and the corrupt politicians and all this stuff, those screws would have been tightened. It would have been really bad for independent media people. It would have been bad for just the slow degradation of society that we're seeing and discourse. All the screws would have been tightened against us. So Trump, although I did not support him, by throwing this chessboard up or driving the truck through it or whatever you want to use to describe it, I think that has created a net good in that right now there are more people talking about politics, reevaluating what they think, getting engaged, whether for him or against him, than I've certainly seen in my lifetime.
Okay.
Trump getting elected has created a net good because more people are talking about politics, reevaluating their beliefs, and becoming engaged? What kind of a moronic argument is this? People are becoming more politically engaged because they're opposed to the atrocious things that Trump stands for. People are outraged at his climate change denialism and desire to slash environmental regulations. They're furious that our president is a bumbling idiot who struggles to string together two coherent sentences without veering off into another direction and babbling incomprehensibly. They don't like the idea that our already abysmal healthcare system is being made worse. They don't like tax cuts whose greatest beneficiaries are the very wealthiest minority of Americans, the very last people who need any financial relief in this country. They're unhappy that Trump has appointed to head governmental agencies people whose views are antithetical to the core goals of these agencies, such as Scott Pruitt heading the EPA and Betsy DeVos heading the Department of Education. We have elected as president a person whose views would be incredibly damaging if they were enacted, and people are rightly unhappy about this. If you look at these circumstances and all you can think to say is, how wonderful it is to see so many people thinking about these things and becoming politically engaged, it seems like you really don't understand the gravity of what's going on around you. You could make an identical argument about a brutal, murderous tyrant. Imagine that there was a ruler in some country that tortured and killed political opponents, threw people into concentration camps, and so forth. If the population became so outraged by the terrible things he was doing that they began taking to the streets and became more politically active, who in their right mind would describe the coming to power of such a tyrant and his actions as a net good, simply because it impelled people to think more about politics, evaluate their beliefs, protest against him, and politically oppose him? Dave Rubin talks about how the screws of governmental corruption would have been tightened had Hillary been elected. While I agree that Hillary had clearly been corrupted by corporate America, I have to wonder if Dave has been paying any attention to what's been going on with the Trump administration since his election. Recall that while Trump campaigned on his goal to drain the Washington swamp of corruption, once elected, he wasted no time populating his administration with billionaires, CEOs, and Wall Street bankers. Rex Tillerson, for example, former CEO of ExxonMobil, a company that provided him with a $180 million severance package, was, until the end of March in 2018, Trump's Secretary of State. Gee, I wonder if Rex Tillerson was looking out for the best interests of that company in the decisions that he made from that position of power. Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, is deeply embedded within corporate America. As Wikipedia writes, quote, DeVos is married to Dick DeVos, the former CEO of multi-level marketing company Amway, and is the daughter-in-law of billionaire and Amway co-founder Richard DeVos. Her brother, Eric Prince, a former U.S. Navy SEAL officer, is the founder of Blackwater USA. DeVos is the daughter of Edgar Prince, founder of the Prince Corporation. In 2016, the DeVos family was listed by Forbes as the 88th richest family in America, with an estimated net worth of $5.4 billion. End quote. Furthermore, as the Center for Responsive Politics writes, quote, since 1989, Betsy Devos and her relatives have given at least $20.2 million to Republican candidates, party committees, PACs, and super PACs, end quote. Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce under Trump, has worked for decades as a banker and investor and has a net worth of about $2.5 billion. Call me crazy, but I'm not terribly confident that this man is the best representative of the poor and middle class in America. Steven Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, worked for Goldman Sachs for 17 years before working for and founding a variety of hedge funds. His net worth is about $300 million. The chief economic advisor and director of the National Economic Council under Donald Trump is Gary Cohn, the former president and chief operating officer of Goldman Sachs. What about some of the policies that the Trump administration has supported? Well, they're pretty much exactly the kind of thing that you'd expect to see from the assortment of people populating his administration. For starters, the Trump tax plan is a gigantic handjob to the wealthiest of Americans. In addition to cutting income tax rates for the wealthiest of earners, the Trump tax plan also repeals the estate tax, which only applies to about 5,460 extremely wealthy Americans, according to the Tax Policy Center. Shortly after his election, Trump wasted little time taking aim at a variety of financial regulations. As the New York Times reports, quote, after a White House meeting with executives from Wall Street, Mr. Trump signed a directive aimed at the Dodd-Frank Act, crafted by the Obama administration and passed by Congress in response to the 2008 meltdown. He also signed a memorandum that paves the way for reversing a policy known as the fiduciary rule that requires brokers to act in a client's best interest rather than seek the highest profits for themselves when providing retirement advice. End quote. My goodness, I bet Goldman Sachs boys Steven Mnuchin and Gary Cohn were furious when they heard about this. How about environmental regulations? Well, the coal and oil industries will be happy to hear that Donald Trump has been rolling these back as well. As the Washington Post writes, quote, Trump's sweeping executive order includes rewriting rules curbing carbon emissions, lifting a moratorium on federal coal leases, and removing the mandate that federal officials consider climate change impacts when making decisions. Trump already approved 2 major oil pipelines, rolled back other limits on extraction and burning of fossil fuels, and eliminated a system that would have made energy companies pay more in federal royalties. End quote. I can't imagine how Rex Tillerson and his friends in the oil industry must be tossing and turning at night, agonizing about the environmental consequences that these rollbacks will have. So with all of this in mind, let's return to that statement made by Dave Rubin. The screws of government corruption would have been tightened under Hillary Clinton. While that may be true, after examining the resumes of some of the highest officials in the Trump administration, and after evaluating some of the policies that they've pursued, it is abundantly clear that Trump is no anti-corruption stalwart. Dave also claims in the interview that the right wing is more tolerant of ideas than the left.
But as a general rule, there is no question in my mind that people that are thought of as traditionally right at the moment are being more tolerant of other ideas than people of the left. It's just, I see this in every walk of life.
It should go without saying that we shouldn't put much currency behind a statement as broad as this one, especially considering that he doesn't substantiate it with any examples or argumentation. He just throws the assertion out there and jumps to the next topic. Hardly the most convincing thing I've ever seen. A person could just as easily make the reverse statement, that people on the left are being more tolerant of other ideas than people on the right. But if neither person cares enough to explain themselves, then this gets us nowhere. It would also be childishly easy for me to list off examples of people on the right being intolerant of other views. Intolerant of gay marriage, intolerant of transgenders in the military, intolerant of atheists, and so forth. But frankly, I don't see what there is to gain by having a dick measuring contest, where we list off a bunch of things to see which group generally stacks up as more tolerant than the other. I would also add that I don't think tolerance is always a good thing. It's actually very overrated if you ask me. Why should I be tolerant and accepting of climate change deniers, for example, given that we're in the midst of an environmental catastrophe? Why should I be tolerant of the view that homosexuality is an abomination, or that religious apostates deserve to be killed? How could it possibly make the world in the future a better place by going easier on these people? From what I've seen, most of the time, tolerance is just a word that people toss around when they're unhappy with your criticisms of their beliefs. You hear it from religious people in particular all the time. It's a fallback position that they always seem ready to retreat to when they can think of nothing else to say. Well, I just think we should be tolerant and respectful of other people's beliefs. Tolerance for idiotic and harmful views does not move society forward. If anything, it holds us back. Challenging these views, debating these people, putting pressure on them, this is what ultimately makes the world a better place. Next, we have another characteristically Dave Rubin-esque, offhanded jab at the left.
I think basically if you could get a group of progressives to sit down and not scream at you that you're a bigot and a racist and a homophobe, which, by the way, I'm sure that there are people that use those slurs on you, even though you are of the left and consider yourself a progressive. I think if you could get some people to sit down and really talk about ideas and these principles and the philosophic underpinnings of the things that we're talking about, I think you could get people to understand that if your problem is the corruption, the problem is the money, and all of those things, then stop making the problem bigger. If you could get a group of progressives to sit down and not scream at you that you're a bigot and a racist and a homophobe.
Right, because it's just such a miraculous feat to find any progressives who won't scream at you and call you a bigot, racist, and homophobe. I mean, I could hardly hear a word you said, Dave, in your conversations with Kyle Kulinski or David Pakman, because they were just screaming racist and homophobe virtually the entire time. You barely got a word in edgewise. You know, I was actually having some pretty serious writer's block working on this video, because I couldn't think of anything more to say, aside from that you're a bigot, racist, and homophobe. I mean, those are the big three right there, baby. What more needs to be said? Logical conversation? What? What does that even mean? You're speaking a different language here, Dave. We progressives are just so simple-minded and unreasonable. This gets us to a big problem with the whole approach taken by many members of the anti-SJW, anti-regressive left crowd. Their perception of the left is tainted by textbook sampling bias. The countless videos of calm progressives having cordial, rational discussions about things like income inequality, healthcare, and corruption are just not going to catch fire on social media and go viral, like a video of a hysterical, screeching lunatic like Trigglypuff.
Please keep your comments to the Q&A section.
Keep your hate speech out of this campus!
Utter madness.
No,
I don't agree with that.
Then why the fuck did you accept the position?
Because
Who the fuck hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a pastor, you should step down.
But just because isolated examples exist of certain individuals acting in this crazy way, doesn't mean that the rest of the left, or any significant portion of the left, is like this. Viewing the left as best represented by its most extreme and irrational elements is fundamentally illogical, yet such a biased and unfair tactic is the bedrock of much of the anti-SJW movement, and it certainly appears to be the foundation of much of Dave Rubin's analysis. Pakman argues at one point in their interview that there's an overblown emphasis on the SJW branch of the left, and Dave disagrees and responds by basically cherry-picking a few examples.
But you and I have talked privately about our concerns with the sort of speech policing, trigger warning, safe space stuff. We've both talked about that. We've expressed concern about some knee-jerk positions that don't seem fact-based on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. I think it's a matter of degree that I think you believe that those issues are much bigger among the left than I perceive them to be. And I've talked about the college campus stuff that's going on, but I still think it's limited to a particular type of mostly, liberal arts colleges. I don't think it's the major issue that some of your guests make it out to be. Are we sort of having a disagreement on the degree to which these issues are a problem?
So as for the free speech stuff, no, I don't think that I'm overstating it or that my guests are overstating it. This idea of the trigger warnings, of the safe spaces, of the speech police, of deplatforming Richard Dawkins at Berkeley, which is happening on August 7th. He's been deplatformed. I'm actually interviewing him in New York at the 92nd Street Y on August 8th. They haven't stopped us yet, but I'm sure there will be people that aren't happy that we're doing that. This kind of insanity, stopping Jordan Peterson from speaking. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about what happened with Brett Weinstein up at Evergreen State. So Evergreen's a great example, by the way, because this is supposed to be the most left. You could argue that this is the most left college in America, or certainly in the top 10. So you would think that they would have all this harmony, that these ideas of non-racism and plurality and all of this stuff and multiculturalism would have worked. But the students there would have you believe that this is some sort of insane, racist, crazy place. Brett Weinstein was fighting racism. He was fighting segregation on campus.
So notice what happens here. Pakman argues that Rubin is overblowing the degree to which these things are a problem, and Rubin basically responds by providing him with a couple of egregious examples of this behavior. Yeah, Dave, nobody is denying that these things are happening. Nobody is denying that there are examples you can point to. The point Pakman is making is you are simply exaggerating about the prevalence of such behavior. And Pakman does a great job of stopping Rubin and making precisely this point.
No, I get that. And I defended him. I mean, I got a call about it a couple of weeks ago and I defended him. And, a lot of my family is college professors. And I've got an announcement to make about a college involvement that I'm going to be having. And from everything I'm looking at, there are these several dozen examples that you cite. But the idea that the left at large has been taken over by this, it's like I went to the Women's March rallies here in Boston, and there was about 10% stuff that I thought was totally unproductive and a shutdown of attempts for open debate, and it was bad and I'm against it. But I'm just not on board that it's a problem to the degree that you think it is, and I think it's really easy to look at these isolated incidents and believe that it represents everybody on the left, but I'm just not seeing it.
There's also an excerpt from David Pakman's deeper dive video on this subject entitled The Truth About Political Correctness that's worth sharing here.
I also don't understand why there are people who call themselves liberal and spend 99% of their time complaining about political correctness on Reddit or on their YouTube channels, wherever. Even if their complaints about political correctness are sometimes justified, it's low-hanging fruit. Yeah, political correctness is sometimes a problem, and it's sometimes used to warp debates or stop them altogether. But in and of itself, it is not the paramount issue that some make it out to be. And, quote, solving political correctness, whatever that even means, is not going to improve the lives of Americans and citizens of the world in the way that dealing with so many other issues would. Whether your audience is left-wing, right-wing, or somewhere in the middle, criticizing political correctness is just trendy right now, especially on the internet. It's profitable. It appeals to people's emotions. There are an endless number of people that are hungry for anti-PC talk, and it's way too easy. There are so many YouTube channels where if you were to turn it into a drinking game, take a shot every time you hear the word trigger warning, safe space, or regressive while we're at it, you'd be dead pretty soon. Okay, so talk about political correctness and how it's bad and how it's impacting society, but then move on to the countless other important issues that are impacting the world. If all you talk about is political correctness, I start to wonder whether that's the only thing you're capable of discussing, whether you actually know enough about policy and government to talk about other crucial issues. Blogs and YouTube channels who just moan nonstop about feminism and trigger warnings, commentators like these are just providing intellectual fast food.
Spot on. Dave Rubin responds to Pakman's previous point and goes on in the interview to say the following things.
Well, first off, I've never said it represents everybody on the left. It represents what the mainstream left has become, without question. Now, we can just disagree on the percentage there, and that's fine. But when I go to college campuses, I get kids from every walk of life and every color and sexuality and all that stuff, all that diversity that the left loves. I care about diversity of thought more. But I get kids saying that their teachers are telling them to use certain gender pronouns. They say, well, I'm not against trans people, but if I see someone and they happen to look like a man, I'm going to say he or him. And I'm not trying to offend anybody, and they want them to use Z or Z or whatever the hell it is, that these ideas which are taking root in the left, this strange alliance with Islam, all of this stuff that's taking root in the left is not being countered by anyone on the left. Actually, anytime someone on the left tries to counter it, they're kicked out. Who on the left, besides you, is calling this stuff out? Who is calling out this crazed intersectional lunacy of the Dyke March? And who's calling out Linda Sarsour and all that? You know what? They're not. They're actually tweeting more and more. I stand with her, Bernie and Van Jones and all of these people. So who is doing it in an effective way, calling out their worst elements?
There's a lot to deal with here. First, there's the claim that these crazy views represent what the mainstream left has become, and that it's not being countered by anybody on the left. It's easy to talk in generalities, like Dave does, but it's important to actually break this down carefully to determine where the truth lies. Rubin cited the topic of Islam as one example of the deterioration of the left. I think it is true that not enough people on the left unequivocally condemn Islamic beliefs, consequences, and apologists. That said, there are prominent critics of Islam on the left. Aside from the obvious ones like Sam Harris, Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins, and Majid Nawaz, some that come to mind are Kyle Kulinski, David Pakman, Matt Dillahunty, and Lawrence Krauss.
He basically makes this connection that liberals are too soft on Islam, that in the name of trying to be good people and in the name of equality and in the name of tolerance, they go too far in their acceptance of what is actually a conservative culture because it's a religion and it's dogmatic, and that is Islam. So is he right? Is he wrong? Why not? Well, he's both overwhelmingly correct, okay, but also I think he does gloss over some nuance. So I have some minor disagreements with him, but he's certainly right that there are certain liberals who, in the name of tolerance, they become tolerant of intolerance.
There are some who hesitate to ever use the term Islamic terror or radical Islam. And there are even individuals who go further, and I get emails from some of them who say, David, even if a Muslim perpetrates an act of terror and says that they did it because of Islam, it still doesn't actually have anything to do with Islam. That doesn't make any sense to me. That does not seem like a logical analysis to me.
I don't think I've ever seen him or any of the other people who are accused of it actually say that all 1.5 billion Muslims are the problem. As a matter of fact, most of them tend to go out of their way on occasion because this is a frequent criticism.
But they associate like 20, 30%, and that's
because that's what the numbers are.
At the same time, the question is it rational to believe that to accept as the undeniable word of God the claims of an illiterate peasant, that they were visited by an angel who told them the truth? I view that in Islam as equally ridiculous as, for example, the claim of Joseph Smith in the Mormon religion that he was also visited by the same angel, by the way, much later, who also revealed the truth to him.
At the same time, there are prominent figures on the left who I would argue function as apologists for Islam, certainly at times, such as Reza Aslan or members of the Young Turks. Keep in mind, however, that there are prominent people on the right who do the same thing. It was a constant theme during the Bush administration, for example, to reiterate that Islam is a religion of peace.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. His teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. There are thousands of Muslims who proudly call themselves Americans, and they know what I know, that the Muslim faith is based upon peace.
So it's not like this is a uniquely leftist phenomenon. And it's one thing to point to a few people in the public spotlight and jump to conclusions, but it should go without saying that if you want to understand the prevalence of certain views held by people on the left, actual polling data that provides precisely this information is infinitely more useful than just cherry-picking a few notable individuals and pretending like they represent the mainstream views on the left. So what does the polling data in this area indicate? Pew Research found that Democrats, or those who lean Democratic, on average, view Muslims with a favorability rating of 47 out of 100, compared to 33 out of 100 for Republicans, a 14-point difference. So from this, we can conclude that while Democrats generally have a slightly more positive view of Muslims than Republicans, it's not like people on the left are just a bunch of lovers of Islam and its followers. Another specific example cited by Dave is the absurd request to use weird gender pronouns like Z or Z. This is a ridiculous example because this is utterly inconsequential. When somebody says, please use a different gender pronoun, the world has not ended. This is not a threat to society in any way. This doesn't cause tangible harm. And nobody is obligated to do this. If somebody tries to police your language in this way, if they try to order you to use different gender pronouns, and you don't want to, just tell them to fuck off. Just tell them, I'm not going to do that. I'll use whatever words I want to use, and I don't appreciate you policing my language in this condescending way. How hard is that? Why do some of these self-professed free speech crusaders act like such gigantic pussies when it comes to things like this? Why can't they just grow some balls and assert themselves when they encounter a person like this? They agonize and whine about things like this that have no real consequences. Someone asked me to use words that I don't want to use. So tell them to go fuck themselves and move on with your life. Problem solved. Another example given by Dave of the degeneration of the left was Bernie Sanders and Van Jones tweeting in support of Linda Sarsour. I don't know much about Van Jones, so frankly I'm not going to jump to his defense here, but regarding Bernie Sanders, it's very clear that this is a disingenuous example. Recall that Linda Sarsour was one of the primary organizers of the 2017 Women's March. Bernie's tweet on January 23rd, right around the time of the Women's March, was obviously meant to be a gesture of solidarity for the general protest that was going on, in favor of women's rights, female empowerment, and so forth. It's not like Bernie was saying here that he agrees with the vulgar statements made by Linda Sarsour towards Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example. It's not like he's endorsing her backwards and harmful religious views, and it's presumably these things about Linda Sarsour that Rubin rightly finds so problematic. Bernie was clearly expressing his support for the Women's March, so to imply that Bernie endorses Linda's views generally is deceptive and dishonest. And I would argue that Rubin does imply that when he says the following.
Who's calling out Linda Sarsour and all that? You know what? They're not. They're actually tweeting more and more. I stand with her, Bernie and Van Jones and all of these people.
Now let's broaden things out and see whether any influential leftists speak out against things like social justice warriors, safe spaces, trigger warnings, political correctness, identity politics, and so forth. Dave Rubin has made clear, both in this interview and in countless other forums, that he thinks very few people on the left do. And he is just plainly wrong about this. In addition to David Pakman, people who have criticized these things include Kyle Kulinski, Sam Cedar, Bill Maher, and even members of the Young Turks, who are commonly seen as the vanguard of the regressive left.
Our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial. And we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own. Words cannot describe how much I love this letter.
Just about everything that this country has to offer in terms of culture and, frankly, ideas has been appropriated from a different culture. And so, I mean, I think you're right to think that that perspective is extreme.
All the more reason not to drive people into their arms with crazy political correctness. For example, The Economist last week drew the wrath of the liberal website Media Matters, who said that their jalapeno flag cover was the sort of stereotype that ignores Latinos as a multifaceted community and relegates them to chili pepper consuming constituents. Hey, Media Matters, can I say one thing to you? Shut the fuck up.
I think that overall and generally speaking, I agree with him. I don't think that safe spaces really make sense on a college campus, especially when it has to do with people that you find controversial or if you disagree with their ideas. What I know from, this past year, when you ban a speaker, you only give them what they want.
But if you're talking about a psychological safe space or an intellectual safe space, no, not buying it.
Even politicians on the left have been speaking out against these things. For example, here's Bernie Sanders rejecting identity politics.
But it is not good enough for somebody to say, hey, I'm a Latina, vote for me. That is not good enough. I have to know whether that Latina is going to stand up with the working class of this country and is going to take on big money interests. Now, one of the problems, one of the struggles that we're going to have right now, let me lay it on the table in the Democratic Party. It is not good enough for me to say, okay, well, we got X number of African Americans over here. We got Y number of Latinos. We have Z number of women. We are a diverse party, a diverse nation. Not good enough.
And here's Barack Obama speaking out against closed-minded college students.
Sometimes, there are folks on college campuses who are liberal and maybe even agree with me on a bunch of issues who sometimes aren't listening to the other side. And that's a problem too. I was just talking to a friend of mine about this. I've heard some college campuses where they don't want to have a guest speaker who, is too conservative, or they don't want to read a book if it has language that is offensive to African Americans, or somehow sends a demeaning signal towards women. And, I got to tell you, I don't agree with that either. I don't agree that when you become students at colleges, have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. Anybody who comes to speak to you and you disagree with, you should have an argument with them. But you shouldn't silence them by saying you can't come because, I'm too sensitive to hear what you have to say. That's not the way we learn either.
So well-known people on the left, including political commentators, public intellectuals, and politicians, do criticize the key things that Dave Rubin doesn't think they do. What about people on the left generally? Let's look at freedom of speech, which is one of the primary things that Dave Rubin focuses on in his tirades against the left. Some key pieces of polling data are very informative on this question. Gallup performed a study in 2016 entitled Free Expression on Campus, a survey of U.S. college students and U.S. adults. And the findings are not at all in alignment with the idea that the left uniquely threatens freedom of speech while the right cherishes it. One question they asked to U.S. college students specifically was the following, quote, If you had to choose, do you think it is more important for colleges to create a positive learning environment for all students by prohibiting certain speech or expression of viewpoints that are offensive or biased against certain groups of people, or to create an open learning environment where students are exposed to all types of speech and viewpoints, even if it means allowing speech that is offensive or biased against certain groups of people?" End quote. They found that 72% of Democrats thought that an open environment and allowing offensive speech was more important than a positive environment that prohibits certain speech. 84% of Republicans answered in the same way. When they asked U.S. adults the same questions, the results were identical for Democrats and Republicans, with 66% saying that an open environment and allowing offensive speech was more important. Another question they asked college students was, quote, "Do you think colleges should or should not be able to establish policies that restrict each of the following types of speech or expression on campus? How about expressing political views that are upsetting or offensive to certain groups?" End quote. 28% of Democrats said that colleges should be able to restrict them, compared to 25% of Republicans. Quote, "How about using slurs and other language on campus that is intentionally offensive to certain groups?" End quote. 77% of Democrats say that they should be able to restrict them, compared to 65% of Republicans. Quote, "How about wearing costumes that stereotype certain racial or ethnic groups?" End quote. 72% of Democrats said colleges should be able to restrict them, while 56% of Republicans said the same. Pew also reported in 2015 that 60% of Democrats think people should be able to say things offensive to minorities without government censorship, compared to about 77% of Republicans. So it's clear from all of this polling data that the majority of Democrats on most questions fall on the pro-freedom of expression side. On most of these questions, Democrats and Republicans are either very similar in their answers, or Republicans have them edged out slightly. These are hardly the kind of polling results that we'd expect to see if Dave Rubin's worldview was actually accurate. There is certainly not the kind of sharp, partisan divide that we would anticipate seeing if we got all of our information about freedom of speech from the Rubin report. Regarding freedom of expression specifically, it is empirically false to say that the anti-free speech SJW branch of the left represents what the mainstream left has become, because the polling numbers show that the majority of people on the left disagree with this SJW branch on most questions of freedom of expression. And on some of the questions where the majority of Democrats fall on the opposed to free speech side, the majority of Republicans also fall on this side. So the political reality is nothing like the fantasy land that people like Dave Rubin inhabit. What about deplatforming controversial speakers on college campuses? Based upon how Dave Rubin talks about this issue, one would imagine that there's a virtually unanimous and resounding consensus on the left that such speakers should not be allowed. Well, what are the facts? Let's examine some polling data released by Morning Consult and Politico in April of 2017. They asked, quote, "Which of the following statements comes closest to your view, even if neither is exactly right? Universities should not allow guest speakers to appear on campus if the guest's words are considered to be hateful or offensive by some." End quote. 41% of Democrats said this comes closest to their view, compared to 24% of Republicans, a 17% difference. 38% of liberals chose this answer, compared to 24% of conservatives, a 14% difference. McLaughlin and Associates gathered polling data, specifically from undergraduate college students, on this same question in 2015, and they found that Republicans were actually more likely to support university bans on speakers who have a history of engaging in hate speech than Democrats were. As we can see, when presented with the statements, quote, "My college or university should forbid people from speaking on campus who have a history of engaging in hate speech," end quote, 61% of Republicans agreed, compared with 57% of Democrats. So once again, we see that the illusion promulgated by Dave Rubin evaporates before our eyes when we carefully investigate it. What Dave Rubin does is cherry-pick isolated incidents that align with his narrative. He takes the most extreme and irrational elements of the left, and he asserts, unjustifiably, that these are the views held by the mainstream left. When you actually go issue by issue and break down the numbers, it becomes absolutely clear that his perception and portrayal of the left is not even remotely accurate. Dave also says, quote, anytime anyone on the left tries to counter this stuff, they're kicked out, end quote. There's no such thing as being kicked out of the left. It's not like a club where security guards will drag you out if you become unruly. It's simply a label that we use to summarize our political views. So when a person like Kyle Kulinski criticizes these crazy SJWs or criticizes apologists for Islam, his views on healthcare, taxation, government spending, the drug war, social security, and so forth don't suddenly vanish. The totality of his political views aren't somehow magically transformed into republicanism because of his disagreements on a few particular issues with a small subset of an extreme faction of the left. I know that Dave seems to think that his opposition to the regressive subset of the left in particular means that he can no longer reasonably associate himself with the left in general, but he is just wrong about this. You can disagree with the more unsavory views and tactics of SJWs while still being on the left politically, as many of us do. After watching this video, I hope it's absolutely clear to you by now that Dave Rubin very often gets things wrong. His perception and portrayal of the left is not even remotely accurate. This recent interview on the David Pakman Show was a clinic in falsehoods, strawmen, and poorly thought out, poorly researched viewpoints and arguments which are unsupported by evidence and unsupported by the basic facts. Thank you all for watching and listening, everybody. If you like my content, consider becoming a paid supporter on Patreon. You can also follow me on Twitter, and if you click the bell next to the subscribe button, you'll receive updates when new content is posted on the channel. You can also subscribe on my website, askepticalhuman.com, to receive email notifications when new writing or videos are posted. Once again, thank you all for watching and listening, and until next time, take care.